Now for philosophy it is fatal, it is very basis, proves to be faith and not self-hate. Hence, by proving that the teaching of faith of the Torah is possible, one proves in effect that the alternative, the teaching of philosophy taken as a whole, is impossible, and thus that the teaching of the Torah is not only possibly true, but simply true. Maimonides alludes to this by saying that while he does not possess a demonstration of the creation out of nothing, someone else may have such a demonstration. Still, this does not mean more that we may know that the world was created out of nothing. It does not mean that we can know why it was created. I illustrate this by a parallel. According to the Maimonides, the laws given by the Torah are perfectly rational. But this does not mean that God had to give these laws. He could have created man who would do by nature and unvaryingly the right things, and not through obedience to laws which they can transgress. We do not know why God preferred the one alternative to the other. The ultimate reason is that we do not know and cannot know why God created man or anything else. Since God is the most perfect being, the highest and complete good, creation does not increase goodness. God, as a good God, is under no obligation to create man in the world because this would increase goodness. Creation is an absolutely free or gratuitous act, an absolutely mysterious act. The coherent expression of this view is Maimonides' doctrine of the divine attributes. Such 11 chapters devoted to the doctrine are probably that part of his guide which in the 19th and 20th centuries is most famous. According to that doctrine, God is absolutely one, absolutely simple. Strictly speaking, he does not possess any attributes. Hence we cannot speak of God, all speech presupposing the distinction, the difference between subject and predicate. God is simply beyond speech, beyond logos, pure mystery. But we could not pray, for example, if we did not speak about God or ascribe attributes to God. But these attributes, according to Maimonides, are only homonyms with the corresponding attributes we ascribe to man: wise, willing, just, merciful, etc. We cannot help speaking of God as knowing and of God as willing. Insofar as something is intelligible, we trace it to God's wisdom. Insofar as it is not intelligible, but merely factual, merely given, we trace it to God's will. Strictly understood, God's intellect and God's will are identical, but it is slightly less misleading to trace the world as a whole to God's unfathomable will than to his inscrutable knowledge. This doctrine of attributes is set forth in the guide on the basis of the assumption that God is one, or absolutely simple. The proof of the assumption is given later on in the work. That proof, however, is identical with the proof that the world has been created out of nothing. Creation by God as a most perfect being presupposes that God is absolutely mysterious, beyond logos, absolutely simple. In other words, philosophy as an attempt to replace opinion about the whole by knowledge of the whole presupposes that the whole is intelligible, but the whole is not intelligible. Only a small part of the whole, the earth and the earthly beings, can be understood by man. Yet the earth and earthly beings are conditioned by the non-earthly, and the non-earthly can only very imperfectly be understood by man. Philosophy or science is then decisively insufficient. philosophy must be supplemented, completed, or crowned by revelation. And revelation is necessarily a particular revelation, the Torah, a revelation to chosen human beings. That choice, while related to Abraham's meritorious faith, cannot be explained by that faith. The content of the revelation is necessarily mysterious, but not irrational. If the letter of the Bible is against reason, we are in an obligation to explain the passage as a figure of speech. The guide is then opposed to both the philosophers and the literalists. Also, it makes use of philosophy, but this use is not more than the recovery of our own. All wisdom of the Greeks ultimately stems from the Torah. Now, this may suffice as a very rough sketch of the surface of the guide. To prepare a somewhat better understanding of Maimonides' work, let us take a somewhat closer look at Maimonides' discussion of the biblical commandments. Prior to him, the view seems to have prevailed that these commandments are partly rational, say the prohibition against murder, and partly merely positive, say the prohibition against eating meat and milk together. But the merely positive commandments are nonetheless of high dignity, if not of higher dignity than the rational ones. Moreover, the examination of the grounds of the commandments was discouraged, not to say forbidden. This view agrees perfectly with Maimonides' tendency to find the ground of everything ultimately in God's unfathomable will. But very surprising, Maimonides attempts to lay bare the grounds of all commandments, the rational as well as the non-rational ones. He claims that he has virtually explained all biblical commandments. He refers to the warning against explaining the commandments, but he disregards that warning by deed. He explains these commandments, which at first glance are wholly unintelligible, for example the details of the sacrificial legislation, as measures taken to combat idolatry, and therewith as not necessary in themselves, but only negative, and therewith, given the disappearance of idolatry proper, as useless now. Nor is this all. His assertion that he has explained virtually all biblical commandments is matched by the assertion that he has not explained more than a few of the biblical commandments. He very conspicuously contradicts himself regarding a matter of the greatest importance. What does this mean? Before I begin to answer this question, I must cast a glance at the common understanding of Maimonides. There is a long history of interpretation of Maimonides. That history began in his lifetime and continued in an unbroken tradition until the end of the 18th century. In the 19th century, historical understanding took over. A break in the continuity occurred. Students of Maimonides in the 19th century were men brought up in modern Western philosophy, i.e. in a philosophy of Christian origin. Furthermore, it was thought that the modern historian has a better understanding of Maimonides' background than Maimonides himself. For instance, the modern historians all could read Aristotle in Greek, and Maimonides had access to Aristotle only in Arabic translation, not to say only in Arabic commentaries on the Arabic translation of Aristotle. The modern historians saw that Maimonides' Aristotle was not the true Aristotle, but a mixture of